The storm of the century has swallowed Havenwood whole. No power, no signal, no way out. In the heart of the chaos, a child's life hangs by a thread, and every tool, every system, every piece of technology has failed. Sheriff Williams, once the town's unshakable protector, now faces the unthinkable. With nowhere left to turn, he makes a desperate choice: to place their final hope in the hands of a man everyone else has rejected. High above the buried streets, in a forgotten watchtower battered by snow and silence, lives a figure the town calls a ghost, a man with a past too heavy to forgive and a secret too powerful to ignore. But behind those cold concrete walls lies something no machine can replicate, a bond forged in loyalty, tested by time, and destined to change everything. Because sometimes salvation doesn't come from power grids or satellite signals. Sometimes it comes from the one soul the world has cast aside. A bitter northern wind swept across Havenwood, turning the town's narrow streets into rivers of drifting snow. The sky hung low and heavy, an iron-gray dome that promised more storms to come. On the outskirts of town, beyond the last streetlight and up a steep, winding road, stood the old watchtower on Howling Hill, a relic of the Cold War era, forgotten by most, but not by the man who now called it home. Ethan Cole stood at the reinforced window of the tower's main room, a steaming mug of black coffee in his hands. In his late 30s, Ethan was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a face carved by years of service, strong jawline, deep-set gray eyes that once scanned crime scenes with precision, and a faint scar running from his left temple down to his cheek, a souvenir from a night gone wrong. His dark brown hair, now peppered with early strands of silver, was cut short out of old habit. There was a quiet heaviness about him, the kind that clings to people who've seen too much and spoken too little. 5 years as a police officer in Chicago had taught him many things, but the last lesson, the one that broke him, was that even the right choice could destroy everything. It had been 2 years since that night. A hostage situation gone wrong. A single shot fired too soon. A young boy, no older than 12, had been caught in the crossfire. Though the department cleared Ethan of wrongdoing, the boy's mother had looked at him with eyes so full of hatred that he had never been able to forget them. In that moment, the badge on his chest had felt like a burden too heavy to bear. So he resigned, sold his small apartment, bought an old truck, and drove north as far as the roads would take him until he reached Havenwood and the crumbling watchtower that nobody wanted. The tower had once been part of a military observation post, its concrete walls and rusting steel girders built to withstand the harshest winters. Now it was Ethan's refuge. He had reinforced the windows, repaired the generator, and wired the place with a patchwork of radios and communication equipment salvaged from auctions and scrapyards. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to keep the world out, and his ghosts in. The town below was visible from his vantage point. Rows of tidy wooden houses, a church steeple rising above the rooftops, smoke curling from chimneys into the frigid air. To Ethan, it felt like looking down at a life he no longer belonged to. Beside him, sprawled on a thick wool rug, lay Ranger, his 6-year-old German Shepherd K9 partner. The dog's coat was a striking blend of sable and charcoal, his intelligent amber eyes scanning the room even in moments of rest. Ranger had been with Ethan since the beginning of his career, a loyal, steady presence through every call, every chase, every sleepless night. When Ethan left the force, there had been no question. Ranger left with him. The department had offered to reassign the dog, but Ethan refused. Ranger wasn't just a working partner, he was family, the last thread connecting Ethan to the man he used to be. The dog stirred now, lifting his head and tilting it with a questioning whine, sensing the weight in his owner's silence. Ethan gave him a faint smile and reached down to scratch behind his ears. "It's just us now, buddy," he murmured. Life in Havenwood moved on without Ethan, or at least it pretended to. Down in town, people spoke of him in hushed tones. They called him the ghost on the hill or the cop who couldn't let go. Children dared each other to climb the path up to the tower, but rarely made it past the tree line. To them, he was a mystery, a shadow. To their parents, he was something worse, an outsider with a gun and a dog that looked more wolf than domestic. The hostility wasn't always direct, but Ethan felt it every time he drove into town for supplies. Conversations would stop when he entered the general store. Eyes followed him down every aisle. Once, someone had even spray-painted "Go Home" on the side of his truck. He'd scrubbed it off without a word, but the message lingered longer than the paint. He told himself it didn't matter, that he wasn't there to make friends, but deep down, a small part of him ached for the acceptance he knew he didn't deserve. The only person who treated him with any semblance of normalcy was Sarah Whitmore, the owner of Havenwood's tiny grocery and hardware shop. Sarah was in her mid-40s, tall and willowy, with chestnut hair always tied back in a loose braid and warm hazel eyes that held a mixture of curiosity and quiet strength. She had lived in Havenwood her entire life and knew everyone's secrets, though she never shared them. Her late husband, a volunteer firefighter, had died in an ice storm 10 years ago, and since then, Sarah had run the store alone with a resilience that Ethan respected. She never asked about his past, and he never volunteered it, but there was an unspoken understanding between them. Two people carrying burdens they didn't talk about. Still, even Sarah couldn't change the way the rest of the town felt. Rumors had a way of growing in small places, and soon they were impossible to outrun. Some said Ethan was hiding from the law. Others whispered that Ranger had killed someone and been retired from the force. Ethan didn't correct them. Let them think what they wanted. It was easier than explaining the truth, that he wasn't dangerous, just broken, and that the tower wasn't a fortress, but a cell he had built for himself. At night, when the town below went dark and the wind howled through the pines, Ethan would sit by the radio, listening to the endless sea of static and the occasional crackle of distant voices. Some were ham radio operators in faraway states. Others were fishermen calling in weather reports from the Great Lakes. To most people, it was just background noise. But to Ethan, it was comforting, predictable. Unlike people, radio waves didn't judge. They didn't care about the past. They simply moved forward, relentless and indifferent. He admired that. Sometimes he thought about driving away, packing up the truck, loading Ranger into the passenger seat, and disappearing again. But where would he go? He had chosen Havenwood for its isolation, and now that isolation had become his reality. He was safe here, invisible. And if that meant being hated, so be it. At least up here, in his cold concrete tower, he could breathe. On that frigid morning, as the first flakes of another storm began to fall, Ethan stood alone at the window and watched the town stir to life, unaware of how much their lives would soon depend on the man they had cast aside. Ranger shifted beside him, tail thumping softly against the floor. Ethan took a slow sip of his coffee and exhaled. He didn't know it yet, but the storm approaching Havenwood would do more than bury the town in snow. It would tear down the walls he had built around himself and force him to decide whether he was ready to be more than a ghost. The following week brought with it a colder, sharper wind, one that seemed to slice straight through the streets of Havenwood and into the bones of its people. Down in the heart of town, in the Pine and Stone Municipal Hall, the atmosphere was just as frigid. Word had spread quickly since the mayor's latest council meeting, whispers turning into conversations, conversations into outrage. Now those murmurs had taken shape in the form of a petition, and the man leading the charge was as relentless as the northern weather itself. Richard Thompson, the town's mayor, stood at the head of the long oak table, addressing a room full of familiar faces. In his late 50s, Richard had the sharp, polished look of a career politician, neatly combed silver hair, clean-shaven jaw, and a habit of wearing tailored suits even in the dead of winter. His smile was practiced, the kind that could disarm a reporter or sway a stubborn council member. But there was a colder ambition behind his warm handshake. He had been mayor for nearly a decade, during which time he had transformed Havenwood's modest downtown with coffee shops, boutiques, and a new civic center. Yet the tower on Howling Hill, standing like a scar on the town's skyline, had always been a thorn in his side. Now, with the promise of a lucrative ski resort project on the horizon, he saw his chance to remove it once and for all, and the man living inside it. At the far end of the table sat Bob Henderson, his thick arms crossed over a flannel shirt stretched tight across his broad chest. In his late 40s, Bob was a large, barrel-shaped man with a trimmed salt-and-pepper beard and the kind of heavy, calloused hands that told stories of decades spent hauling lumber and building homes. He owned Henderson Hardware, the town's only hardware store, and saw himself as a straight talker, a man who didn't mince words and didn't trust outsiders. Bob had never liked Ethan Cole. From the moment he saw the former cop's truck parked in front of Sarah Whitmore's store, he'd decided that no good could come from a man who hid from the world with a wolf-looking dog and a tower full of strange equipment. "Folks," Mayor Thompson began, his voice smooth and commanding, "this isn't about hatred, it's about safety. That structure is unstable, outdated, and dangerous. It's only a matter of time before someone gets hurt." He gestured to a blown-up photo of the watchtower pinned to an easel. "This is an eyesore, and a liability. We've already had one accident. Are we willing to wait until it's something worse?" Bob rose to his feet before the mayor could continue. "We all know who lives up there," he boomed. "He's not part of this town. He doesn't come to events, doesn't join community meetings. Hell, he barely speaks to anyone. And that dog of his? That's no pet. That's a predator. Looks more like a wolf than a dog." A few nods and mutters of agreement rippled through the crowd. Bob pressed on, feeding the momentum. "I've seen him. He watches us. He drives into town, grabs his supplies, and then bolts like he's got something to hide. We don't know who he is or what he's doing up there, and frankly, I don't want to find out when it's too late." In the back row, Sheriff Mark Reynolds listened silently, his jaw tight. At 45, Mark was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a square jawline and a neatly trimmed beard, a figure that carried quiet authority. His years in law enforcement had taught him the value of patience and perspective, and his eyes, steel blue and steady, rarely missed anything. Mark had moved to Havenwood 3 years earlier after a career in a larger city's police department had burned him out. The quiet pace of small-town policing suited him, but the distrust and hysteria swirling around Ethan bothered him more than he was willing to admit. Mark cleared his throat and rose to speak. "I'd like to clarify a few points for the record," he said evenly. "Mr. Cole has lived on that property for 2 years. In that time, my office hasn't received a single complaint about him. Not one. His dog has never been reported as aggressive, and has never been seen off the property. And the so-called incident we're referring to was a trespassing misdemeanor. A couple of teenagers went where they weren't supposed to, and one of them got a cut that needed a few stitches. That's all." The room went quiet for a moment, but Bob's scoff broke the silence. "That doesn't make it safe, Sheriff," he retorted. "Just because he hasn't done anything yet doesn't mean he won't. That tower is a magnet for trouble. We're trying to protect our kids." "And I respect that," Mark replied, his tone calm but firm. "But there's a difference between caution and paranoia. Mr. Cole isn't breaking any laws. He's a private citizen on private property. Maybe instead of trying to drive him out, we try talking to him. A conversation can go a long way." The suggestion was met with derisive laughter from several people. A woman near the front, Margaret Lewis, a retired schoolteacher known for her blunt opinions, shook her head. "Talk to him? He's had plenty of chances. People like that don't change, Sheriff. They hide away for a reason." Mayor Thompson seized the moment. "I appreciate your perspective, Sheriff," he said, his voice carefully measured. "But the overwhelming sentiment here is clear. This is a public safety issue, and the council has a duty to act." He held up a thick stack of papers, the petition now covered in signatures. "We will be submitting this to the county, asking them to declare the tower a hazard and order its removal." Applause broke out across the room, a wave of vindication washing over the crowd. Mark remained standing, his arms folded, watching the scene unfold with a growing knot of frustration. He knew fear when he saw it, and he knew how dangerous it could be when left unchecked. Ethan wasn't the threat. The threat was ignorance and anger dressed up as community concern. But he also knew that arguing further would change nothing. The tide had turned, and it wasn't on his side. Later that night, long after the meeting had ended and the town hall had emptied, Mark walked alone through Havenwood's snow-covered streets. The festive glow of Christmas lights twinkled from shop windows, but it did little to brighten his thoughts. He stopped near the edge of town, where the last row of houses gave way to the dark silhouette of Howling Hill. Far in the distance, a single faint light burned in the watchtower's window, a stubborn, defiant glow against the night. Mark stood there for a long time, his breath clouding in the frigid air. He thought about Ethan Cole, the man the town had turned into a monster. He thought about the fear that had gripped the people he had sworn to protect. And he thought about how easily good people could be blinded by their need for a scapegoat. One thing was certain. If the storm the weather reports promised truly came, Havenwood might discover that the man they feared most was the one they needed most. And Mark Reynolds, for one, intended to be ready when that day arrived. The storm arrived not with a crash, but with a slow, creeping inevitability. At first, it was just wind, a sharp, whistling current that swept through the pines and rattled loose shutters along Main Street. Then came the snow, fine, powdery flakes that danced lazily in the air before thickening into a relentless white curtain. By nightfall, Havenwood was buried beneath a suffocating weight of winter, and every road, every rooftop, every familiar landmark vanished under a blanket of frozen silence. The town was cut off. No electricity, no phone signal, no internet. What had begun as another northern storm had become something far more dangerous: isolation. In the heart of town, the Finch household was plunged into darkness. Dr. Alistair Finch, Havenwood's only physician, was a man in his late 60s with a tall, wiry frame and a face carved by decades of compassion and long hours. His snowy white hair was always slightly disheveled, his kind blue eyes framed by deep lines of worry that had only grown more pronounced since his wife passed away 5 years ago. He had raised his only daughter, Lily Finch, alone, a bright, gentle 9-year-old with chestnut hair and a smile that could melt even the iciest of winters. But tonight, Lily was not smiling. She sat propped on the living room couch, gasping for breath, her small chest heaving as the familiar sound of wheezing filled the room. "Breathe slowly, sweetheart. Nice and slow," Dr. Finch said, trying to sound calm, though his heart was hammering. He reached for the emergency inhaler. Empty. He knew what that meant. Lily's asthma had always been manageable, but stress and cold air were dangerous triggers. The storm had brought both. He needed the nebulizer in his clinic 2 blocks away, but when he looked out the window, the world had vanished into a howling white void. The snowdrifts were higher than the porch railing, and the street beyond was buried in an endless surge of blowing snow. The roads were impassable. The power was out. His phone had no signal. His daughter was suffocating before his eyes, and there was nothing he could do. Across town, Sheriff Mark Reynolds sat alone in his office, illuminated by the dim yellow glow of a single oil lamp. The radio tower outside, once alive with chatter from county dispatch and neighboring towns, was dead. The satellite phone, bought with grant money after the last major storm, blinked an unhelpful message. Signal lost. Mark rubbed a hand over his stubbled jaw, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. He had been on the phone with the mayor hours earlier, trying to convince him to open the town hall as an emergency shelter, but Mayor Thompson had dismissed the idea as unnecessary panic. Now, as he looked out at the swirling chaos beyond his window, Mark wondered if the town would pay for that arrogance with lives. A knock shattered the silence. The door flew open and Dr. Finch stumbled in, his hair and coat plastered, with snow, his face pale with fear. "Mark, it's Lily," he gasped. "She's having an asthma attack. The inhaler's gone, the roads are impassable. I need help. She doesn't have much time." For a moment, Mark's mind went blank. He had no ambulance, no communications, no way to summon outside help. Then, slowly, an idea, wild, desperate, and reckless, began to form. He turned toward the window, his eyes drifting toward the faint outline of Howling Hill, now barely visible through the storm. "There's one option left," he muttered. Dr. Finch followed his gaze. "You can't mean—" "Yes," Mark said, his voice hardening with resolve. "Ethan Cole." Dr. Finch hesitated. Like many in town, he had judged Ethan harshly, had warned Lily to stay away from the man in the tower. But now, judgment was a luxury they couldn't afford. "Do you really think he'd help us?" he asked quietly. "I think he's the only one who can," Mark replied. "He's got radio equipment up there, better than anything we have here. If anyone can get a signal out, it's him." Within an hour, Mark had assembled a small team, 2 of his deputies, Deputy Samuel Brooks and Deputy Jenna Morales, both bundled in layers of insulated gear. Sam was a stocky, broad-shouldered man in his early 40s with a trimmed beard and a pragmatic streak. He'd been born and raised in Havenwood and had a deep love for the town, even when it frustrated him. Jenna, in her early 30s, was tall and athletic, with sharp green eyes and jet-black hair tucked under a wool cap. She was new to Havenwood, having transferred from a department downstate after a messy divorce, and still carried an air of restless determination. A woman trying to prove herself in a place that wasn't sure it wanted her. Together, they stood in the garage beside the sheriff's office, staring at the hulking snowplow that was their only hope. "It'll get us part of the way," Sam said, adjusting his gloves. "But once the drifts get too deep, we're on foot." "Then we keep going," Mark replied, his tone brooking no argument. "We're not coming back without help." The snowplow roared to life, its diesel engine belching smoke as it pushed its way into the storm. Visibility was nearly zero, just a swirling tunnel of white illuminated by the headlights. The vehicle lurched and groaned as it climbed toward Howling Hill, each gust of wind shaking its massive frame. Inside, Dr. Finch clutched Lily's empty inhaler in his hand, staring out the windshield as if he could will the plow forward with sheer desperation. Halfway up the hill, the inevitable happened. A wall of snow, packed hard by relentless wind, stopped the plow dead in its tracks. The engine roared, the tires spun, but they weren't going anywhere. Mark slammed his fist against the dashboard. "Damn it!" "We're stuck," Sam said, his voice grim. "Then we walk," Mark answered. But when he opened the door, the reality of the storm hit him like a physical blow. The wind was so strong it nearly knocked him off his feet. Snow swirled in blinding sheets, and the cold bit through every layer of his clothing. Even with snowshoes, they'd never make it. "We'll die out there," Jenna said, her voice barely audible over the storm. "A mile and a half in this? We wouldn't last 20 minutes. Mark stared into the blizzard, his mind racing. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him, Lily's life, the town's safety, everything. And then, through the roar of the wind, a new sound reached his ears, a low, distant bark. Dr. Finch turned sharply. "Did you hear that?" The barking came again, closer this time. And then, out of the white void, a dark shape emerged, a powerful wolf-like figure pushing through the snow with deliberate purpose. Ranger. The German shepherd bounded toward the plow, his coat crusted with ice, his eyes burning with intelligence and resolve. When he reached them, he began pawing at the door and whining urgently. "That's Ethan's dog," Jenna said, astonished. Mark pushed the door open, and Ranger leapt inside, shaking snow from his fur. Around his neck was a small, waterproof pouch. Mark tore it open and found a piece of paper inside, the handwriting precise and deliberate. "I see you. Give me coordinates. Situation?" "EC." "He knows we're here," Mark breathed. "He's watching." For the first time that night, a spark of hope flickered to life. Maybe, just maybe, they weren't as alone as they thought. From the high vantage point of the watchtower, Ethan Cole pressed his face to the frost-lined window, his breath fogging the glass as he strained to see through the blinding wall of white. The blizzard roared like a living thing, howling and thrashing against the old steel frame of the tower, but amid the swirling chaos below, he had caught it. A flicker of amber light, faint but steady, barely visible through the veil of snow. A stalled engine. A distress beacon. It could only mean one thing. Someone was out there, and they were in trouble. Ethan adjusted his binoculars and focused. The shape resolved into the familiar bulk of a county snowplow, half buried at the base of the hill, its headlights weak and sputtering. The sheriff had come. Ethan's stomach tightened. He didn't know why Mark Reynolds would risk a suicide run through a storm like this, but the fact that he had meant one thing, it was serious. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. He turned toward Ranger, who had been lying near the wood stove, his ears pricking up the moment Ethan spoke. The 6-year-old German shepherd rose gracefully to his feet, his muscular frame rippling beneath his sable and charcoal coat. "It's them," Ethan said quietly, crouching down and fastening a small, waterproof pouch to the dog's collar. Inside was a message written on weatherproof notepaper. "I see you. Give me coordinates. What's the situation?" EC Ranger stood still as Ethan checked the harness one last time, then pressed his forehead against the dog's. "Find them," he whispered. "Find Mark." At the sound of his name, Ranger let out a low, eager bark, the same sound Ethan had heard 100 times before on patrols, raids, and searches. But this time, the mission was different. There were no criminals to chase, no missing hikers to track. This was about life and death. And as the heavy door of the tower opened with a groaning protest, Ranger disappeared into the white abyss without hesitation. Ethan paced the floor like a man possessed. He hated waiting, hated the helplessness of it. But there was nothing else he could do until he received a reply. He had built this tower into a fortress of sorts, equipped with salvaged communication gear, generators, and even a shortwave transceiver capable of reaching far beyond Havenwood. But none of that mattered if he didn't know what he was dealing with. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Finally, a sound crackled through the static of his old police band radio. Faint, broken, but unmistakable. "Cole, this is Sheriff Reynolds. Coordinates, over." Ethan lunged for the receiver. Copy, Mark. Your signal's weak, but I've got you. Send coordinates slowly. Through the static came the halting transmission. Ethan scribbled the numbers on a pad of paper, cross-referenced them with his topographic map, and marked the location. 1.4 miles south-southeast, near the second bend in the logging road. They were closer than he'd thought, but the snowpack between them was deep, too deep for anyone on foot. He stared at the map for a long moment, then glanced at the old signal repeater he'd been tinkering with for months. It wasn't pretty, but it might just be enough. Down at the plow, Mark and his team were huddled inside the freezing cab, breath clouding the air as they clung to hope. Deputy Sam Brooks had taken over the radio, trying to boost the signal with improvised wiring. Across from him, Deputy Jenna Morales checked on Dr. Finch, whose face was drawn and pale from worry. "How is she?" Jenna asked quietly. "Not good," Finch replied, his voice tight. "Her lungs won't hold out much longer. If we don't get help soon—" He didn't finish the sentence. Mark leaned forward. "Did he respond?" Sam nodded. "Yeah, he's got our location. Says he's working on a plan." "A plan?" Bob Henderson's skeptical voice came from the back seat. He had insisted on coming along, partly out of stubbornness and partly out of guilt for being one of the loudest voices demanding Ethan's removal. At 50, Bob was still a solid, intimidating man, but now his broad shoulders slumped beneath the weight of fear. "What the hell can that hermit do that we can't?" Mark met his gaze with a calm that was more practiced than real. "More than you think," he said simply. Back at the tower, Ethan worked quickly. He fired up the backup generator, the old diesel engine coughing to life before settling into a steady rumble. He powered on his homemade repeater, a Frankenstein's monster of salvaged radio components and improvised wiring. If it worked, it would amplify their signal enough for a stable connection. If it failed, well, there wouldn't be a second chance. "Come on," he muttered, flipping the final switch. The lights flickered, the console hummed, and then a burst of static, followed by a clear, strong voice. "Cole, this is Reynolds. Do you read?" "Loud and clear," Ethan replied. Relief washed over him. "I need a full sit rep, Mark. What are we dealing with?" Mark's voice came back, firm but strained. 9-year-old female. Severe asthma attack. No meds, no transport, no outside contact. She's critical. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. He didn't know Lily Finch personally, but he'd seen her once or twice around town, always skipping along beside her father, always smiling. The thought of that smile fading made his jaw clench. "Copy that," he said. "I have a high-gain antenna here. If we can link it to your transmitter, I can reach the state emergency network. But I'll need clean data. Vitals, symptoms, duration, everything." "Understood," Mark replied. He turned to Finch, who rattled off the information in quick, clinical bursts. Jenna relayed it back over the radio while Sam scribbled notes. The seconds stretched into minutes, the minutes into what felt like hours. Finally, Ethan's voice came back, calm and steady. "Message relayed to the state. Stand by for response." There was silence, then a new voice, cutting through the static like a lifeline. "This is National Guard Command Post Delta. We copy your emergency broadcast. Air rescue unit en route from Fort Ridgefield. ETA, 65 minutes. Advise maintaining patient airway and warmth until arrival." Dr. Finch sagged back in his seat, tears of relief welling in his tired eyes. 65 minutes, he whispered. "We can make it." Mark let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "You did it, Ethan." "Not yet," Ethan replied. "The storm's shifting. If they can't get a visual on you, they'll have to abort. We'll need to mark a landing zone. Something bright, something they can see through the whiteout." Sam nodded. We've got road flares in the back. We can use those." "Good. Make it happen," Ethan said. "And Mark, keep her breathing." The transmission ended, and for a moment, silence filled the plow. Outside, the storm raged on, uncaring and unrelenting, but inside, there was something new. Hope. They were no longer alone. A man the town had dismissed as a ghost, a danger, a mistake, had just done what none of them could. He had given them a fighting chance. The blizzard had begun to ease, though ease was a relative term. What had once been a screaming wall of white had now become a heavy, relentless snowfall, slower, quieter, but still dangerous. Havenwood was entombed in snow, the streets buried, the rooftops sagging under the weight. In the distance, a faint orange glow flickered in the darkness, road flares burning in a circle around the high school's football field, a desperate attempt to carve a beacon of hope out of the storm. It was the best they could do, and for now, it would have to be enough. Ethan Cole watched the glow through his field binoculars from the tower's observation deck, his pulse steady, but his mind racing. Every minute mattered now. The National Guard had confirmed their ETA at just under an hour, but the swirling winds and near-zero visibility could turn even the smallest error into disaster. He glanced down at Ranger, who sat by his side with ears perked, tail sweeping the floor in slow, rhythmic arcs. "If they can see the flares, they'll make it," Ethan murmured. "If not..." He didn't finish the thought. Ranger shifted closer, resting his head against Ethan's leg, a quiet reassurance that had seen Ethan through far worse nights than this. Down below, the football field had become a makeshift command post. Sheriff Mark Reynolds, his parka hood pulled low against the cutting wind, paced the perimeter as deputies worked to secure the landing zone. Deputy Jenna Morales directed 2 volunteers to clear additional snow from the far end of the field, her gloved hands slicing through the air as she gave orders. Deputy Sam Brooks was rigging a set of backup flares on the west side, his breath fogging with every exhale. Dr. Alistair Finch sat cradling Lily on a stretcher beneath a wool blanket, checking her breathing every few seconds with trembling hands. The girl's lips were pale, her breaths shallow, but she was still fighting. Bob Henderson stood near the bleachers, his thick arms wrapped around his chest, the bitter cold no match for the guilt gnawing at his insides. For years, he had called Ethan a danger, a menace, a ghost that needed to disappear. Now that same ghost had done what no one else could. He had brought help. Bob swallowed hard, his throat tight. Margaret Lewis, the retired teacher who had shouted loudest for the tower's demolition, shuffled beside him in a heavy wool coat, her lined face pale with something that felt suspiciously like shame. "I was wrong," she whispered, her breath barely audible over the wind. Bob nodded without looking at her. We all were. The rhythmic thump of rotor blades was faint at first, just a low vibration beneath the storm's howl, but it grew louder with each passing second. Heads tilted skyward, hearts lifted. Through the swirling snow, a shape emerged. A black and gray rescue helicopter, its searchlight slicing a path through the white. The pilot, Captain Will Carson, guided the aircraft with a steady, experienced hand. Carson, a man in his late 30s with sun-weathered skin and a close-cropped buzz cut, had flown combat medevacs in Afghanistan before joining the National Guard. Calm under pressure and fiercely dedicated, he had a reputation for never leaving anyone behind. Tonight would be no exception. "Clear the LZ," Mark shouted, waving his arms as the helicopter circled once, then descended toward the flare-lit field. Snow whipped in every direction as the rotor wash churned the ground into a blinding maelstrom. The skids touched down with a hiss, and 2 medics leapt out, their parkas marked with bright red crosses. One of them, Sergeant Elaine Harper, a compact, strong woman in her mid-30s with short blonde hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, carried an oxygen tank and mask. Her partner, Specialist Devin Hayes, tall and lanky with dark skin and a calm, reassuring voice, hauled a collapsible stretcher. "Patient is a 9-year-old female," Dr. Finch shouted over the roar of the blades. "Severe asthma attack. We've stabilized her as best we can." Harper nodded sharply, her movements quick and efficient. "We've got her," she said, slipping the oxygen mask over Lily's face with practiced ease. Hayes and Mark lifted the stretcher, moving in sync toward the helicopter. The girl's breathing eased almost immediately under the steady flow of oxygen, and for the first time that night, Dr. Finch allowed himself a trembling sigh of relief. As the medics secured Lily inside, Carson signaled from the cockpit. "We're wheels up in 60 seconds, he called, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We'll get her to Ridgefield Medical. They're prepped and waiting." The helicopter's skids left the ground, rising into the swirling storm like a mechanical angel. The townspeople stood in silence, watching as it climbed higher, its beacon cutting through the blizzard. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, slowly, applause broke out, hesitant at first, then growing until it echoed across the field. Mark stood in the middle of it all, his chest heaving, the weight of the night's events settling on his shoulders. They had done it. Lily was safe. And they owed it all to the man they had cast out. Back in the tower, Ethan watched the helicopter's lights fade into the distance. He let out a long, slow breath and leaned against the cold metal frame of the window. A small, tired smile ghosted across his lips. He didn't need their thanks. He hadn't done it for that. He had done it because it was the right thing to do, because, despite everything, he still believed in protecting people, even those who no longer believed in him. The radio crackled to life again. "This is Sheriff Reynolds," Mark's voice came through, steady but tinged with emotion. "She's safe, Ethan. She's on her way, and thank you. You saved her life, and maybe this town's soul." Ethan stared at the radio for a long moment before replying. "You don't owe me anything, Sheriff," he said quietly. "Just take care of her." But even as he said the words, Ethan felt something shift deep inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose, belonging. Maybe, just maybe, Hyvenwood wasn't done with him yet. At the high school field, the crowd slowly dispersed, their faces changed in ways that words couldn't capture. Bob walked home in silence, his boots crunching in the snow. The image of Ranger's determined eyes burned into his memory. Margaret Lewis paused at the edge of Main Street and looked toward the distant silhouette of the watchtower, its single light shining stubbornly against the dark. For the first time in years, she didn't see a threat. She saw a guardian. The storm still raged over Havenwood, but it felt different now, less like an enemy and more like a test they had survived together. And at the heart of it all, the man they had once called a ghost had become their savior. The morning after the storm broke over Havenwood was unlike any other in living memory. A pale winter sun hung low in the sky, its light scattering across endless plains of snow and ice. The storm had stripped the landscape bare of color and sound, leaving behind a hushed stillness that felt sacred, almost reverent. The roofs of houses sagged under glittering blankets of frost. Telephone poles leaned like weary soldiers, their wires heavy with ice. In that quiet aftermath, the town exhaled for the first time in days. The worst was over, and yet, for Ethan Cole, the longest night of his life had only just ended. Inside the watchtower, the air was thick with silence. Ethan moved slowly down the narrow steel staircase, his hands trailing along the cold railing as if to anchor himself. His heart still hammered from the hours of searching and calling into the void. Ranger had vanished in the chaos of the storm, and though logic told him the dog had likely sought shelter, the gnawing fear that he might never return had hollowed him out from the inside. Every sound, the groan of the generator, the distant drip of melting snow, was a cruel reminder of the absence that haunted him. "Come back to me, boy," he whispered into the empty room, his voice breaking on the words. Then, a sound. Faint, distant, almost unreal, a muffled bark carried on the wind. Ethan's breath caught as he stumbled toward the door, throwing it open so hard it slammed into the wall. At first he saw nothing but the blinding expanse of white. Then, movement, a dark shape struggling through a snowdrift near the tree line. Ranger. The 7-year-old German shepherd was limping, his once proud gait now reduced to a desperate shuffle. His sable and gray coat was matted with ice, his muzzle flecked with frost. Yet his tail wagged weakly when his amber eyes found Ethan. Ethan's boots pounded against the frozen ground as he sprinted toward him, the cold biting at his lungs. He dropped to his knees in the snow, gathering the exhausted dog into his arms. Ranger's body was trembling, his paws raw and bloodied, but he pressed his head against Ethan's chest with a soft whine. Tears, hot, unrestrained, and long overdue, streaked down Ethan's face. "You came back," he murmured, his voice shaking. "You did it, buddy. You never gave up." The walls he had built around his heart for years, the guilt, the isolation, the hardened resolve, crumbled completely in that moment. He was not alone. He had never been. Hours later, the crunch of boots on snow echoed up the hill. Ethan turned from where he sat beside Ranger, now wrapped in a blanket and resting near the tower's heater. Approaching through the pale sunlight was a small group of figures, Sheriff Mark Reynolds leading the way, his broad-shouldered frame still carrying the weight of the town's survival. Beside him walked Dr. Alistair Finch, his kind, weathered face lined with exhaustion but softened by gratitude. And trailing slightly behind them, his hat clutched nervously in his calloused hands, was Bob Henderson, the same man who had once shouted the loudest for the tower's destruction. Mark was the first to speak when they reached the door. "Ethan," he said simply, his deep voice heavy with sincerity. "We're here to say thank you." The sheriff's eyes, steady and resolute, met Ethan's. "You saved Lily's life. You saved this town. None of us will ever forget that." Dr. Finch stepped forward next, his gray hair tousled by the wind. "I've delivered babies, set broken bones, and treated gunshot wounds," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "But I've never been more helpless than I was during that storm. Without you, my daughter would be gone. I owe you everything." Then it was Bob's turn. The hardware store owner, a heavy-set man with a ruddy, weather-beaten face and the stubborn pride of someone used to being right, looked like a boy caught stealing from the candy jar. "I was wrong," he admitted, his voice low but steady. "About you, about this place, about all of it." He swallowed hard, his eyes darting briefly to Ranger before returning to Ethan. "I called you a ghost, a danger. I tried to drive you out, but you were the only one who stood up when it mattered. I'm sorry, truly." Ethan looked at them all, the faces of a town that had once rejected him, now laid bare in humility. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he nodded. "I didn't do it for thanks," he said quietly. "I did it because it was the right thing to do, because it's what I was trained to do." He paused, glancing down at Ranger, who lifted his head as if to punctuate the thought. "But I won't lie. Hearing you say this, it means more than I expected." Mark exchanged a glance with Finch and Bob before speaking again. "We came here for another reason too," he said. "The town council voted unanimously this morning. We want to make this tower an official emergency communications center for Havenwood. We'll supply the fuel, the parts, whatever you need to keep it operational. We don't want to tear it down. We want to build it up, with you at the heart of it." The offer hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For years, Ethan had built walls, physical, emotional, and otherwise, to keep the world at bay. But maybe, he thought, walls weren't meant to isolate. Maybe they were meant to protect. And maybe it was time for those walls to have a door. "I accept," he said finally, his voice steady. "Let's do it." The relief on their faces was immediate and profound. Finch let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Bob wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Mark smiled, a small, rare smile that spoke of trust restored. "Welcome back, Officer Cole," he said. "It's good to finally have you on our side." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky blushed shades of orange and violet, Havenwood began to stir with new life. Power was slowly restored, and windows across town glowed with warm light. Families emerged from their homes to shovel paths and check on neighbors. The storm had stripped them bare, but in its aftermath, it had also brought them closer together. And on the hill above it all, the watchtower glowed like a lighthouse. Its signal lights pulsed steadily against the darkening sky, not as a symbol of isolation, but as a promise. A promise that they would never again face disaster unprepared, that they were stronger together than apart. Inside, Ethan stood by the reinforced window with Ranger leaning gently against his leg. The dog's head rested on his boot, his breathing slow and even. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something deeper than duty. He felt peace. He glanced down at Ranger and smiled. "Looks like we've got a new job, partner," he said softly. "And this time we're not doing it alone." The wind whistled softly outside, no longer a song of loneliness but one of hope. Havenwood had found its guardian. And Ethan Cole, the man once branded a ghost, had found his home. Sometimes, the greatest miracles don't arrive with thunder or light. They come quietly, in the form of a loyal friend who never gives up, a second chance we never thought we'd get, or a light that still shines even when the world has gone dark. Maybe it was no coincidence that Ethan and Ranger stood strong when Havenwood needed them most. Maybe, just maybe, God was working through them, reminding us that His grace often shows itself not in grand gestures, but in ordinary acts of courage, loyalty, and love. And just like that small tower became a beacon for an entire town, faith can turn the darkest storms in our lives into new beginnings. So whatever you're going through, hold on. Keep believing. Miracles still happen, often when we least expect them, and often through people and hearts we once overlooked. If this story touched you, share it with someone who might need a reminder of hope. Leave a comment below to tell us how faith has guided your life, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another story that celebrates the bond between humans, animals, and the divine love that connects us all. May God bless you and everyone you love, today and always.